This podcast is brought to you by the School of Advanced Study, University of London.
All right, well, thank you very much all for coming to the first seminar of the term. And we're very pleased to welcome Ben Slingo. So Ben Slingo has a degree in history from Cambridge and is now pursuing his PhD, also in history, at St. John's College in Cambridge. His dissertation is on the political thought of the Jesuit scholastic in the late 16th and early 17th centuries. Ben's article, Civil Power and the Deconstruction of Scholasticism in the Thought of Marc Antonio de Dominis, has been published in the History of European Ideas. And today he will be speaking on Suarez and the Jesuit scholastic in the genealogy of the state.
Thank you. In the 16th and early 17th centuries, writers across Europe conducted a dispute over political power. Was it concentrated entirely in the person of the prince, who could therefore rule without challenge? Or did it ultimately, or at least in dire circumstances, belong to the people? This dispute was starkly relevant to the world of real politics, and was continually refreshed by flare-ups within it. The gunpowder plot and the measures it provoked, the tensions between James and his parliaments, the French wars of religion and the subsequent assassination of Henri IV, the public burning in several capitals of works by Francisco Suarez, Juan de Mariana, and others. These were only a few of many episodes which speak to our basic question. As such examples imply, behind the one question another often loomed, more or less visibly. How vulnerable was any secular prince to the power of the church? If he could be resisted by the community he governed, he could also perhaps be overthrown by the Pope, as some theorists insinuated and others indignantly suspected. And the struggle for power could, and originally did, pertain to the church itself. Was the Pope's authority absolute, or was he subordinate to the bulk of his own ecclesiastical body politic? This had been a fiercely contested question throughout the late Middle Ages and into the 16th century. Many of the conceptual resources brought to bear on the civil realm were borrowed from the debate over the church and more or less transfigured. Some of the most prominent and theoretically brilliant contributors to this pattern of disagreement were scholastic theologians, including eventually those from the Society of Jesus. Only founded in 1540, the Jesuits soon claimed an outsized role in Catholic intellectual life and church politics, not least as sturdy but sophisticated proponents of the papal interest. Suarez and his Jesuit colleagues, like Gabriel Vasquez, Luis de Molina and Robert Cardinal Bellarmine, made their political interventions in a variety of overlapping and mutually enriching genres, from pamphlets commissioned in response to events, via systematic refutations of Protestant thought, to learned commentaries which sought to recover and renovate the moral theology of Thomas Aquinas. Though their participation in confessional politics was more intense than that of their predecessors, and their papalism correspondingly less ambiguous, they worked in a recognisable tradition. Ever since the 1520s, Dominican theologians in Salamanca had been forging an account of politics that was Thomist but also importantly new. These Spanish scholastics were shaped, in turn, by debates at the turn of the 16th century in Paris and Rome. In taking this tradition forward, the Jesuit authors became perhaps the prime adversaries of Jacobean royalists in England, Venetian critics of papal power, and so-called Gallican defenders of the French crown and church in its independence from Rome. And their arguments were linked, by way of complex patterns of borrowing and criticism, to outwardly very different combatants in the theoretical struggle over political power, the Huguenots in France, say, and some of their fellow Calvinists in Scotland. Modern readers of these debates, and of the scholastics' place within them, tend to approach the subject from a particular perspective, one to which I've already started to succumb in the last few minutes. We ask certain questions of the text, most to do with where political power lies, who has it, and who does not. We ask where power originally comes from. Do rulers get it from God, or from the community, or from individuals in some pre-political state? Whoever has power first seems to have some sort of political priority. And we ask how power can be moved about once it exists. Can, say, the whole people, as the original wielder of power, surrender, alienate that power to a king? Or can they merely delegate it to a prince who acts thereby as their minister? We also ask whether those who do have political power can be constrained or resisted. and whether, if so, the people entitled to resist might not themselves be the ultimate repository of power. As this last leap implies, we are often interested not just in power, but in supremacy, in sovereignty, if you like. When we read Suarez or Bellarmine or James VI and I, and when we forge an interpretation that accommodates them all, our point of reference tends thus to be the problem of who they think is in charge. And that has caused trouble. Though the questions I've rehearsed are obviously pertinent, indeed urgent, the reading they've generated has not been satisfying, particularly in the case of the scholastics. It might evoke the polemical thrust they want to deliver, get close to the position they want to stake out, but it doesn't capture the richness of their political sensibility. Thinking in the way just sketched, historians have tried to categorise various writers as either absolutists if they say the prince is ultimately supreme, or constitutionalists if they say the people is. But the scholastics confound this distinction. They contend that living in subjection to political power is the fate of all people under divinely ordained natural law, but that the founding of any particular commonwealth is a free human decision. They say that political power reaches the prince from the community, and that the prince's claim on it is thus only human rather than divine. But they also warn that the community originally received power from God, and that to disobey the prince is therefore to violate God's law after all. They often insist that there can only be one power in the commonwealth, since logically someone must be supreme, but they also admit that this sovereign can be resisted nonetheless by other political agents, perhaps even to the point of tyrannicide. Both the right to be obeyed and the right to rebel, in fact, have their foundations in natural law. This sort of thinking, whether contradictory or paradoxical or just very subtle, invites a different approach. There is nothing original simply in saying as much. Even those who resort to the categories of absolutist and constitutionalist tend to acknowledge their inadequacy, or at least to note that the scholastics face both ways. And some readers have left the categories behind. But it is interesting to consider what they've done instead. The scholastics' narrowly political thought, their account of the commonwealth per se and of authority within it, has been placed and sometimes even dissolved in a larger theoretical context. Part of the point, we are now led to think, is that these authors don't have a theory of sovereign power which can be made sense of on its own. According to them, perhaps, the political realm grows out of, but also remains within, a broader moral world of natural law and natural rights, which sustains the political, but also intrudes upon it, keeps it from being wholly autonomous. To use Annabel Bett's phrase, the prince's power and the moral constraints from that power are thus two sides of the same coin. The individual state a prince rules, meanwhile, is precisely not yet a state in the strict sense. Both its metaphysical standing as a sovereign entity and its physical boundaries are put in question by the scholastics' firm commitment to the law of nations. This universal law confers rights and imposes duties on human beings which cut beneath the prescriptions of any particular commonwealth, and it perhaps even nourishes a universal human community which transcends all such commonwealths. In the light of these wider concerns, the problem of political authority within a commonwealth seems less central, or at least less readily accessible on its own terms. But in this paper, I want to do something different. Can we, I want to ask, gain a rich appreciation of the scholastics' thought without displacing what we might call their concept of the political? I think we can, if we attend closely to a problem that usually and rather oddly gets neglected. We've been, as I say, very interested in who holds power and how various political agents can pass it between themselves. But we seldom ask what exactly the scholastic authors mean by power, how they theorize it. It tends to be taken for granted, or, when we talk about sovereignty, to be reduced to a purely relational concept in which the supreme part of supreme power rather eclipses the noun it qualifies. Yet there is much here that's interesting and strange and even riddled with tensions. The scholastic authors have a word they routinely use to describe political power, potestas, but it sits in a web of other terms, all connected but all with different connotations. There are, among others, auctoritas, political authority, regimen, rulership or government, principatus, often translated simply as sovereignty, but which also, we will see, implies a sort of supreme ruling function, and jurisdictio, the power to punish even unto death, which we might set alongside the potestas legislativa, the power to make law. There is also the question of how all these things, and the political power they together constitute, can be distinguished and related from and related to other forms of legitimate violence and legitimate authority, the natural right to kill in self-defense, for instance, which everyone has, or the domestic power of a husband, father, and master of slaves. In the rest of my talk, I'll focus on one aspect of this complex of questions, which, I think, sheds a new light on the scholastics' account of political life, and on their place in a larger story in the 16th and 17th centuries. How does political potestas, the power stemming from natural law, originally held by the community and eventually used by a prince, relate to the idea of rulership, and therefore to the particular regime which goes about ruling? It might seem obvious that to wield power is to govern, but for the scholastic authors things are more complicated. I'll try to show how they inherit and develop conflicting views about just that apparently obvious contention, views they try to reconcile theoretically and also recombine in different ways for very political purposes. What we will be dealing with, in fact, is a fraught relationship between the apparatus of government and a more abstract idea of how the political community is ordered. As that might already imply, and as I hope to explore much more closely at the end, we are dealing with the scholastic's contribution to the genealogy of the state. I'll arrive eventually at Suarez, not so much his exhaustive and apparently more rigorous commentary on Aquinas, but instead the Defensio Fidei, a tract he wrote in reply to James I in 1613. It's in this work, I'll suggest, that the late scholastic meditation on the nature of power and government reaches its most striking conclusion. But to realise this much, we must first go back almost exactly 100 years to a very different exchange between Jacques Almain and Cardinal Cajetan. The two episodes together mark important and connected moments in the story I'm hoping to trace, moments in which different ideas of political power, with different implications for the relationship between the community and its government, clashed. It's long been recognised that Almain and Cajetan set the terms for scholastic political thought in the following century, but it's because of their conflicting conceptions of political power, revived and reworked a century later still, that they matter so much to my argument today. And Suarez marks the end of a certain project of thinking about political power and government. Cajetan and Almain mark its start. Let us begin, then, in the 1510s. Almain was a young, dazzling, and soon-to-be-dead theologian at the Sorbonne, Cajetan head of the Dominican order in Rome. The occasion for their dispute was a spat between Pope Julius II and a soi-disant general council of the Church, backed by the French king Louis XII. Cajetan writes that the Pope rules supreme, Almain that the council does, as the representative of the whole ecclesiastical body. Almain is the first of the two to devise a formal definition of political potestas. Though he's ultimately concerned to defend the council's power in the Church, he explains that he'll, quote, treat the origin of civil jurisdiction so that ecclesiastical jurisdiction may be made known through comparison with it. With that comparison signalled, he draws a further analogy between a political community and an individual human being. This is the first quote on the handout. God, the author of nature, created man with a natural right or power, potestas, to obtain those things which are necessary for his sustenance, and to repel those which are harmful, on which right is founded the power to kill anyone who attacks one unjustly. In the same way, any community of people living together in civil association has a natural right to preserve itself, not only in being, but in peaceful being, which includes the prerogative of cutting off, even by death, those whose life disturbs the community. Following Aquinas, Almain appeals to the metaphor of a body politic. Every part is ordained to the whole body, and, if cutting off a certain member is expedient for the health of the whole body, perhaps because it is putrid or infectious, then the authority to cut it off resides in the whole body. Almain's commonwealth is thus a self-sufficient, so-called perfect community, which has all the power it needs to keep itself independent and functioning, safe from external and internal threats. The political power of such a commonwealth is thus analogous to an individual's right to keep himself alive and defend himself from attack. This being so, Almain continues, no perfect community can abdicate its power, just as no man can abdicate the power he has of preserving himself. As God's beloved creatures, with a divinely implanted natural inclination to stay alive, human beings cannot kill themselves or willfully expose themselves to death. In the same way, the Commonwealth, as an analogous body, cannot put itself in danger by surrendering its always needful power. Political power thus lies in the whole body of the community and cannot be alienated. Nonetheless, Almain says, for everyday purposes, the community grants power to a prince or some other regime, say a senate or assembly. The prince only uses, to quote Almain's word, a power which still ultimately resides in the community itself. The dominion of princes, he says, is ministerial. As this would lead us to expect, the prince can be toppled by those on whose behalf he rules. The whole community, Almain argues, has power over such a prince constituted by it, by means of which, if the king rules not to the edification but to the destruction of the polity, it can depose him. Otherwise it would not have sufficient power to preserve itself. The infectious limb the community has the power to cut off from the body politic can thus be the prince himself, as much as any other lawbreaker who acts to the detriment of the public good. The community's power of self-conservation can thus even be wielded against the person to whom it is ordinarily delegated. All this is what we might usually think of as the essentials of Almain's political theory. By defining political power as the community's inalienable right to self-defence, he can vindicate a form of popular sovereignty in the secular realm and in the church. But are there not less familiar and more interesting theoretical implications? Let us take what Almain calls a corollary of his argument as presented so far. He says that the primary power of coercive jurisdiction, the potestas politica he's exploring, is not, in regard to its establishment, purely positive. That is, it's not merely the product of a human law or contract. As we've seen, the community instead has a power of self-conservation under natural law. But, Almain continues, this power's conferral, to quote, on a certain person, such as a king, or certain members of the community, many or few, who rule it aristocratically or timocratically, belongs to positive law. It's not just then that the community retains a hold on its power, and thus control over its prince. More than that, the community's possession of its power, the fact that there is a political community with a power to conserve itself, is divinely ordained and inscribed in nature itself. And by contrast, the various forms of government it might appoint, and which conduct the business of ruling on its behalf, are creatures of contingent human choice. For this reason, Almain says, all the various regimes are essentially the same. Royal government, the term he uses is principatus, aristocratic government, and timocratic government, he says, do not differ among themselves because they are diverse powers, since they have completely the same object, but instead on account of the diversity only of those holding power. Almain's account of political power thus has two levels, one fundamental and the other more cosmetic. The potestas politica in its essence, this natural right of self-conservation which belongs to the community, can be abstracted from the various institutional differences between different commonwealths. It is the same everywhere, whether you are in France with its king, Venice with its aristocratic council, or a democracy like the Roman Republic. Beyond this abstract political power, founded firmly in natural law, there are only the contingencies of human choice. We know that the Commonwealth's power is left untouched by a change of regime, for example. After all, the Commonwealth can overthrow its existing prince precisely in order to conserve itself, and then delegate the same power to someone else without expiring itself as a community. What Almain has devised here, I want to suggest, is theoretically very valuable. He's not just saying that the community itself is a given, a permanently cohesive body politic that predates and survives its rulers. This is what we might expect from a theory of popular sovereignty. Almain is also saying that political power, the means by which such a community is ruled and preserved and held together, also prescinds from any particular form of government. Political potestas, then, is a basis for political life abstracted from its everyday surface. The community does appoint a regime, and the regime does wield political power ministerially, but the fact it's used by an apparatus of government does not speak to the power's essence. If, then, the regime adds nothing new, since its power simply is the community's power of self-preservation on loan, Almain has to explain how everything we associate with a government can be deduced from his first principle of a body preserving itself. In his analogy between the Commonwealth and an individual, we saw Almain introduce man's defensive power to, quote, kill anyone who attacks unjustly. It is this primary power to kill, as he also charmingly calls it, which finds a political analogue in the primary power of coercive jurisdiction, even to the point of inflicting death. Almain thinks that the need to kill troublemakers, whether outside enemies or internal lawbreakers, poses the most serious challenge to any account of political legitimacy. He mentions the remark of the medieval theologian Duns Scotus, that it would not be permissible for anyone to kill by public authority unless in cases specially accepted by God from the commandment, thou shalt not kill. Since enemies and criminals are threats to the community's health, it can kill them illicitly in self-defense, and thus for Almain this toughest of problems is solved without special divine concessions. Everything else, he thinks, follows from that toughest case. The business of rulership for Almain is thus vigilant war-making and police action, a matter of extinguishing threats so that the community stays on alive. For Almain, this nicely covers everything the appointed prince does in keeping the peace, but also captures what the community does in removing such a prince. If he rules to the destruction, not the edification of the Commonwealth, then he becomes another agent on whom the, quote, primary power to kill can be used. It's this argument to which Cajetan must reply. He claims that Almain entirely misunderstands what political power is like, and he executes a clever discursive shift in doing so. Where Almain began with the nature of potestas, Cajetan says the nature of government, regimen, must be considered more deeply. The question in dispute, Cajetan goes on, is whether the whole body of the Church is a free community with respect to the right of ruling, jus principandi, whether, to quote again, the right of ruling resides in the Church, and whether, to quote once more, what characterizes a mystical body with regard to the right of ruling belongs to the Church. In total, over the first 3 pages of his reply, Cajetan uses the word regimen and its cognates 12 times, and the phrases jus principandi or jus principatus 6. For Almain, we saw, principatus means something like regime. It's the term he gives to the form of government, monarchical, aristocratic, and so on, that the community appoints for itself. The principatus is for Almain an epiphenomenon of the community's power to conserve itself. It's something established after the real theoretical action has taken place. Political power can be used precisely against the regime if the community needs to overthrow it. Cajetan, by contrast, seems to make the regime and its ruling function central to his definition of power. He explains very explicitly why. To quote, I speak of the right to rule on account of those things which belong to private persons, like repelling force with force, according to the standard of blameless response, and taking a sword from the hand of a madman, and anything of that sort. Indeed, we shall not be mistaken in keeping those things separate. According to Cajetan, then, the right of self-preservation, repelling force from you, which Almain makes the core of political power, doesn't belong there at all. Cajetan's case for saying this is 3-pronged. First of all, as we quoted, the right to self-preservation is private. Cajetan doesn't think that the power of a commonwealth is analogous to, morally the same sort of thing as, the rights of an individual person. Almain may well prove that each gives a claim to legitimate violence, a right to kill justly, but Cajetan denies that this is enough. There is something distinctively public about political power that can't be understood with reference to the rights enjoyed by private agents. Cajetan also embraces an ampler, more directive version of political power than Almain. According to him, a prince's role is not just to be the judge of his subjects, to wield the jurisdiction that might end in their death, but also to ordain things concerning them. In scholastic legal theory, to ordain is to direct someone to an end by law, and the term captures that element of making law which goes beyond coercing subjects to obey. If to wield power, according to Almain, is to be a morally legitimate destroyer of threats, for Cajetan it is thus more expansive. He invites us to think about the edification of the community, to recall Almain's word, as well as how to avoid and punish its destruction. Yet Cajetan also argues from within Almain's assumptions, appealing not just to the purposes of political power, but to its practicalities. For a community to wield jurisdiction over its appointed government to protect itself against a wayward ruler in Almain's terms, Cajetan says it would need a, quote, tribunal, some sort of governing apparatus to judge and punish the ruler. Cajetan's point, in effect, is that one can't abstract political power from the regime that would exercise it. One can't abstract potestas from principatus. He uses this conclusion to striking effect. If, he says, the community of the Church had power over the Pope, the Church's government regimen would be a popular one. Cajetan is well aware that Almain would object to this line of reasoning. He would claim instead that the Church has the power, but the Pope runs the government as its minister. But Cajetan nonetheless stays firm. The conclusion is perfectly sound, he writes, because if authority is in the whole community alone, therefore as such it constitutes a popular government. Potestas and regimen are for Cajetan inseparable, because the crucial category is principatus, power as rulership. From this point on, Cajetan's argument about the Church makes itself. Everyone agrees that there is a Pope, that the Church has a monarchical regime. If popular power means popular government, then the people of the Church can't have any power at all. Much more explosive is Cajetan's treatment of the civil commonwealth. Here he is happy to agree with Almain that civil power comes from the community and, quote, is devolved by the community to one or more persons. Such a secular community has, just as Almain says, a power which cannot be removed or abdicated. Now, if the community has an inalienable superior power, which it devolves but never surrenders to its king, and if in holding such power it inevitably constitutes a principatus, as Cajetan has claimed, then it follows that all civil commonwealths are democratic. Surely this is monstrously subversive, if not crazy. And yet Cajetan affirms it, up to a point. The commonwealth, he says, might ordinarily exercise its jurisdiction through another form of government, such as a royal one, but there will always be a supreme popular government. Anything else it establishes is merely intermediate. A sort of nice final rebuke to the King of France who'd provoked all this in the first place. So Almain and Cajetan have fundamentally different conceptions of political power, which issue in different accounts of how the Commonwealth is structured. For Almain, the permanent and unifying part of such a polity is not its apparatus of government, nor even quite the community which governs itself, but rather an abstract potestas politica which underlies every more contingent political institution. In Cajetan, by contrast, those institutions are fundamental. The scholastic theorists who write after this debate thus inherit some serious challenges. How to reconcile these two conflicting theories of political power? How to preserve the conceptual suppleness and abstraction of Almain's account while acknowledging Cajetan's point that power implies government? How this task is undertaken over the course of the whole 16th century is not a question I have time to explore. I'll instead move on to discuss a second episode of fierce disagreement in which the conceptual resources crafted by Almain and Cajetan are both recycled and importantly reworked by other scholastic authors following in their tradition. I hope that what follows will strike you as a development of my themes we've been tracing so far, but also as a recurrence of them. My aim is not to draw causal lines across a whole century so much as to juxtapose these two episodes of a broader sensibility. Where Almain and Cajetan are prompted to write by disputing the Church, these later Jesuit theologians seek to defend the Pope's pretensions against the secular commonwealth. During the Reformation, papal sympathizers refined and gave new prominence to an originally late medieval theory about the Church's relation to the state. The Pope, the papalists submitted, was not straightforwardly a king sovereign, who's superior in the same political order. But he could reach across from the spiritual realm to the temporal to intervene when the Church's interests were threatened. Using this so-called indirect power, the Pope could overthrow secular princes who tolerated heresy, persecuted good Catholics, or did any of the other dubious things Protestant or merely pragmatic monarchs were inclined to do circa 1600. As one might expect, this doctrine was bitterly opposed by apologists of royal power, especially in England, where James I interpreted the Gunpowder Plot as a sinister attempt to put the potestas indirecta into practice. A debate thus grew up between those who backed the Pope's power to intervene and their critics. and the origins and nature of civil power formed a central part of it. One crucial issue was this: if a king got his power direct from God and held it by divine right, then he was immune to deposition. There were some grounds of legitimacy so solid that not even the Pope could undercut them. Yet if royal power somehow depended on the community as a function of some human arrangement only, then the king was much more vulnerable. And on this territory, as we've seen, Almain and Cayetan had left various arguments to work with. A representative, indeed classic version of the Jesuits' paperless case was made by Robert Cardinal Bellarmine, the most famous Catholic controversialist of the time. Another came from Suarez himself, in his commentary on Aquinas' theory of law. Let's start with what they have to say. Bellarmine insists that political power, potestas, comes from natural law, because, whether they want to or not, men must be ruled by somebody unless they want humankind to perish. So although for Bellarmine the potestas politica is a natural power of self-conservation, we don't want to perish, its necessary entanglement with a governing apparatus is emphasized from the start. Men must be ruled specifically, and they must be ruled by somebody, by some sort of regime. We find the same thing in Suarez's text. In a perfect community, he says, it is necessary that there be a power which pertains to the governant, gubernatio, of the community. Without such a power of governing, he carries on, there would be the utmost confusion. Bellarmine and Suarez go on to explain that this distinctively governing power comes first of all into the hands of the community, as a matter of default. Divine law and nature, Bellarmine says, did not give this authority to any particular man, therefore they gave it to all. When the community then transfers its power to a particular man, or to some other non-monarchical form of government, it does so only by human law, just as Almain had argued much earlier. As Bellarmine puts it, the individual kinds of government stem from the law of nations, which is a kind of human law, not from the law of nature. For the appointment of kings, consuls, and other magistrates clearly depends on men's consent. The Jesuits can thus reproduce the Almainian distinction between the natural power of the community and the human regime it appoints to govern it. But their argument is subtler, not least because it draws on the insight that power is bound up with ruling. This is a thorny point, but one worth laying out. Because the potestas politica is a governing power, as we've seen, and because the community is not itself a regime, the community cannot exercise the power, as Bellarmine puts it. It must transfer it to a form of government instead. The community's one act of political power, of self-preservation, is to take measures to preserve itself better by establishing a form of government. Only once such a regime is in charge is the potestas politica fully realized, fully instantiated in the world. Bellarmine and Suarez have closely kindred ways of putting that crucial point. Bellarmine distinguishes between political power in general, to quote, without going into monarchy, aristocracy, and democracy, and the particular power, which only arrives once one of those forms of government has materialized. Suarez, by contrast, says that power, absolutely speaking, is by natural law, but its determination to a certain mode of power and of government is by human choice. What I want to stress is that the move from general to particular is a step forward, though it doesn't necessarily seem to be. Suarez's word determination is significant. When he and the other Jesuits talk about law, commenting on Aquinas' legal theory, one of the problems they try to solve is how the human laws of a pope or a prince are derived from the moral principles of natural law. Human laws must be based on natural law, must somehow express its moral values, but they must add something new. They can't just codify what we already have to do by nature. The Jesuits explain that human law goes beyond natural law by specifying it. Giving it a particular determination is the word they use. So when Suarez and Bellarmine write that the power of a regime is determinate or particular, whereas the power of a commonwealth is merely general, they are likewise indicating that something is added, made usefully concrete. They and other Jesuits, including Luis de Morena and Rodrigo de Arriaga, in fact draw an explicit analogy between the passing of a human law and the institution, by human right, of a regime by the community. To understand one is for them to understand the other. All this is why, unlike the Armenian community's power, the general power of the Jesuit Commonwealth has to be alienated to a regime, not merely delegated. In the process of the transfer, something important changes. We can see now, I hope, how this account meets the Jesuits' political needs. Because all secular princes rule only by human right, the Pope can depose them without going against natural law, which is to say God-given law. Once a commonwealth has its prince overthrown in this way by the Pope, it reverts to a sort of quasi-political primordial state, holding political power as a community but needing to institute a new regime so that power can be used properly and take on its fully instantiated form. It may be that these arguments sound slightly shaky, and that's certainly what the Jesuits' royalist critics thought. The most formidable and sophisticated of them, I think, was Marc Antonio de Dominis, an ex-Jesuit himself who found his way to the court of James I. The core of his critique is once again the fraught relationship between political power and governance, a relationship he thinks the Jesuits have fudged. Like Bellarmine and Suarez, and like Cayetan before them, de Dominis takes power to imply rulership. He calls it a potestas rectiva, or a regimen activa. The Jesuits, as we saw, divided this power into two stages, the general and as it were primordial power of the community, reminiscent of Almain's abstraction, and the more particular and fully realized power of a regime. De Dominis' point is that the first of these, the power the Jesuits attribute to the whole Commonwealth, isn't power at all. All the Commonwealth can do and must do, de Dominis points out, is pass its so-called power on to a ruler, subject itself to someone else. As he says, the scholastics place power in the community so that from natural necessity, without any liberty, they apply it entirely to one person or several. They make a free choice of the form of government, but they cannot not choose, and instead conserve themselves in liberty. To de Dominis, this signals not temporary possession of power, but rather enduring impotence. In a delicious subversion of the idea that the prince is the people's servant or operative, the Commonwealth is for de Dominis a mere messenger, as he says, channeling power submissively from God to its eventual recipient. The community's role entails for itself only, to quote, a passively held inclination towards being biddable and governable. Taking measures to provide yourself with a regime does not count as ruling, is what de Dominis is saying. This critique suits his purposes as well as the Jesuits' account suits theirs. If the Commonwealth never meaningfully holds political power, acts only as an obedient channel through which it can pass, then it cannot interrupt the passage of power from God to the regime that eventually holds it. It follows that if God grants power by natural law, as the Jesuits insist, he must grant it directly to princes like James by natural law. And if that's the case, those princes can't be deposed by the Pope. Once again then, at the beginning here of the 17th century, a conception of power as something abstract and permanent, which underlies the contingent institutions of government, which gives the Commonwealth a unity and stability without reference to its regime, runs into opposition. Once again, the idea that power must be strictly tied to rulership is introduced to frustrate things. We could perhaps end there, with a dialectical stalemate that captures the sharply conflicting currents in scholastic political thought at either end of the 16th century. But de Dominis' treatise has a special appendix in which he confronts an argument not satisfactorily answered in the objections we've just sketched. This coda, he explains, is directed against what Suarez writes in his other work, the Defensio Fidei. The argument in that book, I want to close by suggesting, represents the most interesting and surprising effort to grapple with the tensions we've traced. Suarez starts familiarly enough, commenting that political power can be considered in a precise way as a supreme power of ruling by abstracting it from the mode of regime. Therefore, it can be established, to quote, how political power is immediately from God, and nonetheless kings and senates are not from God, but from men. All this we have heard before, except for two intriguing hints. One is that the word Suarez uses for power here is not potestas, but principatus, a word that, as we've seen, is only ever really associated with the apparatus of government. Along with this, Suarez says here that monarchies and aristocracies are products of human contract, logically posterior to the original grant of power to the Commonwealth. but he doesn't mention the democratic form of government in the same breath. So what's going on? Suarez explains by telling us that, to quote, "there is a very great difference between the species of political government, for monarchy and aristocracy cannot be introduced without positive human institution, as we've seen, but democracy without any inconvenience can be acknowledged as having an as it were natural institution." This is very striking. Almain and Bellarmine and Suarez himself in his earlier book had all distinguished between political power in the abstract, underlying all regimes, and the different forms of government themselves. Suarez here is trying to do the same thing. He still talks, remember, about power being abstracted, but he puts the democratic apparatus of government on the other side of the line. For Suarez, the abstract and primordial political power, logically prior to any other regime and destined to survive any other regime, is not an indeterminate, still to be specified potestas, but a fully fledged democratic principatus. And of course, if that's so, there's no doubt about whether the Commonwealth's original power from God is real power, with which it can rule itself. De Dominis' original objection is answered. This is daring, but it leaves Suarez with two problems. First, the objection De Dominis does level at the Defensio in that appendix of his. Surely this will lumber us with democracy, which everyone agrees is the worst form of government, forever. And second, of deeper interest to us. Surely a democratic principatus, a fully fledged regime, is not really any different from the aristocratic and monarchical regime that might replace it. The whole theoretical charm of Almain and Bellarmine's accounts is the contrast between a supremely abstract and resilient and stable underlying potestas and the many contingent human variations that can be so flexibly and interchangeably attached to it. Suarez seems to lose that. It's interesting in dealing with these challenges that he makes his most interesting points of all. He draws a classic scholastic distinction between preceptive natural law, which forces one to do or be something, and permissive natural law, which simply allows one to do something by default. The naturally ordained original democracy is of the second kind. The community can keep it, or change it for another form of government as it wills. To make this vivid for us, he draws an analogy, which is quite famous. Under natural law, man is born by default, free rather than a slave. But, Suarez says, this lucky condition is merely permissive. If a man wanted to sell himself into slavery, he could do so without violating any natural principles. In the same way, a commonwealth which naturally runs itself as a democracy can surrender its power to a monarch or a senate. What's so interesting about this is that it makes the original democratic commonwealth analogous to a free man, and the same commonwealth under a future monarchy analogous to a slave. The move is usually taken as evidence of Suarez's absolutism. The people of a polity can hereby give up all their power to a prince. But I think it's more significant that the original democratic commonwealth is implicitly free, unenslaved. There's a difference in one's political condition in this regime compared with the others. This might seem a speculative way to treat a metaphor, but Suarez then reaffirms the point. He says the following: "The liberty of a man is opposed to his servitude, and this rationale applies in the same way in the case of a composite or fictional person, like a human polity or community. Insofar as one of those is ruled with a power stemming from God by natural law, it is," Suarez continues, "free and sui juris, for this liberty does not exclude, but rather includes the power of ruling itself and commanding its members. It excludes, however, subjection to another man." What we have here, improbably, is a kind of scholastic republicanism. There is a conceptual distinction, Suarez says, between the original democratic regime and the monarchy or aristocracy that might replace it. We can still talk about political power abstracted from one of those more particular forms of government. But the essence of this distinction is no longer that the original power is more general, or less bound up with an institutional apparatus. It's rather that the original community, with all its own institutions, is more free. Now, Suarez also rehearses all the usual pieties about how monarchy is best, how we should leave this free state behind us, and I'm not interested in doubting his sincerity. I do think it's worth registering, though, that scholastic reflection on political power can end up at a destination so rarely associated with it. Ending on this note of republicanism is one further reason I should very briefly relate all I've said to a recent argument, one that's in a sense lurked behind this whole paper. In his British Academy lecture on the genealogy of the modern state, Quentin Skinner looks for historically and makes the case for philosophically the kind of distinction I hope we've been tracing the fortunes of here. The distinction, that is, between the present apparatus of government and some more abstract, more permanent substance that makes a polity a unified whole. Something, in his words, distinct from rulers and ruled. Skinner finds that idea only in what he calls the fictional theory of the state, the thought brought to consummation in Leviathan that the political unity abstracted from ruler and ruled must be an artifact of representation. The other two theories of the state Skinner detects in the early modern period reproduce the categories with which we started at the beginning. They are, he says, absolutist and constitutionalist, and as ever, there is an ambiguous scholastic contribution to each of them. What I've tried to do this evening is, in one sense, to supplement and maybe complicate this reading. I've tried to say the scholastics have their own troubled and contested political abstractions which aren't strictly fictional, they aren't straightforwardly to do with representation, but they aren't just absolutist or popular either. Thank you.
Thank you very much.